Thank you for joining us on this third day and final day of our conference. It is my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Ivana Milojević, our final keynote. For more than 3 decades, she has challenged the ways in which futures are imagined and practiced. As a researcher, writer, and educator, her work has consistently invited future scholars, educators, policymakers, and communities to question dominant assumptions about progress, development, and social change. She has drawn attention to the cultural narratives, the values, and power relations that shape anticipatory practices and influence what societies consider possible. A distinctive feature of her contribution is the ability to move seamlessly between scholarship and practice. Throughout her career, she has worked as a foresight specialist and consultant with universities, governments, international organizations, and communities around the world, while developing a substantial body of research spanning futures, gender, and peace studies, sociology, education, and social transformation. As founder of the global foresight think tank MetaFuture, Ivana has played a pioneering role in creating spaces where futures thinking becomes both intellectually and socially engaging. More recently, her writings have explored how anticipation might benefit from approaches grounded in dialogue, care, plurality, and feminism. Dr. Ivana Milojević remains a powerful advocate for the cultivation of alternative futures. Today, she joins us with a keynote entitled Alternative Temporalities and Choices of Our Futures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ivana Milojević.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the organizers for all the hard work you've done. Manuela, incredible. Thank you for everybody for being here this morning, especially after that dinner last night, which I think made it a little bit difficult to come here on time. So I really appreciate you being here. And it is wonderful being here among so many colleagues and friends and sharing some of my thoughts that some of you are familiar with and some are not. But I did my best to kind of address the theme of this conference. And we were given a really hard task. We were to rethink how ideas about futures operate within conditions of uncertainty, indeterminacy, and unknowing, shaping through aesthetics, ethics, epistemologies, and material practices. So that is a lot, right? I will try to touch upon all of those themes. Let's see how I go. And a few years ago, actually in 2019, there was an exhibition here in Milano by the performance artist Marina Abramović. One day I hope to hang from the ceiling like that, you know, that lightness of being from trauma that she so well portrays. And that image and that piece of work, she entitled Homage, The Kitchen, Homage to Saint Teresa. So I would also like to start my presentation with an homage to my own teacher, somebody who introduced me to future studies in 1993, Eleonora Barbieri Massini, a sociologist and educator like myself, and I learned a lot from her. In 1993, obviously that is not such a unknown or something so revolutionary these days, but for me as a postgraduate student in 1993, just that idea that there is more than one future, that there are alternative futures that we can use to think about the present rather than extrapolating from the past was actually revolutionary. It was mind-boggling then, because of the context I came from and because of the process we did there. So thinking about our decisions and our present moment in terms of where we want to go rather than where we've been, or in terms of those projected kind of predicted futures, was something that informed my thinking since then. and I found it liberating. Another piece of work that I really enjoyed by Eleonora was something she wrote, a text she wrote, Women as Builders of Alternative Futures. And in that text, she argued that women have the capacity to imagine alternatives not because of any ontological qualities, right? Not because somehow we have special biological traits, but just by the virtue of exclusion. Being excluded from dominant systems of meaning, being excluded from dominant ways that our societies operate, gives you what feminists call that double point epistemology, and you can have a gaze both from within and from the outside. So I really enjoyed that text of hers. She also introduced me to the works of Elise Boulding, and Elise Boulding is, as some of you would know, one of the founding members of both peace studies and future studies. She made an enormous contribution. I was very disappointed with the Oxford Encyclopedia for Peace and Conflict Studies put her under Kenneth Boulding. So she doesn't even have her own entry, even though she made absolutely enormous contribution for both of those fields. So this is how things work in our world, right? And I learned a lot of things from her. For example, the notion of 200-year present, which is using that expanded, based on future generations thinking, based on family thinking, based once again on women's ways of knowing, where you spend lots of time taking care of your family. So it is 200 years present, which refers to our grandparents and our grandchildren, those that were born 100 years ago and are still alive today, and those born today that will be alive 100 years from now. So that's the notion of expanded present. And I think it's even more important now with this instantaneous gratification and short-termism that we are all experiencing on a daily basis. I think that concept of hers is even more important now than when she coined it. Obviously, in the area of peace futures, she influenced me a lot. I read most of her, if not all of her books. And she has this thing about this quote that I put up there, that imagining a responsible future is seen to be based on both knowing the past and gaining knowledge of other aspirations and cultures. And I think this is really important because as futurists we go forward, but we also need to go backward. And the more further into the past we go, the more we find things that show us that perhaps our times are not so unprecedented, that perhaps polycrises were always around. I myself don't remember the time when I did not live in a polycrisis, when I didn't live in a, Shadi's laughing, she feels the same. So it's this sense that something that is maybe novel, maybe it isn't, and the further we go, the more complete picture of our current reality we get. As well, looking throughout the space, different cultures, World Future Studies Federation, that kind of introduced me to futures thinking and future studies, was a global organization and was consciously trying to bring those multiple voices from the margin. Now, we talked a lot here about uncertainty. There is, I think, at least 3,000-year-old tradition that deals with this, both at a cognitive level and at a practical level. It's called, it just uses different terminology. It's the Buddhist notion of impermanence. And that notion of impermanence is both something that you cognitively grasp, but also you can practice on a daily basis. What does that mean, that we all live in impermanent conditions? There are all sets of practices, meditations, and so on, that helps us deal with that uncertainty without going into freak-out mode. So that's what I learned from Elise Boulding, and this is what I learned from Eleonora Massini. Now, before I move any further, to go back to framings and definitions of our kind of framework here, I mean, why we are here, Anticipation Conference. We are here talking about the discipline of anticipation. This is a definition by Riel Miller, Roberto Poli, and Pierre Rossell. And basically, it's about all efforts, all phenomena all ways of knowing, the later than now as, being anticipation. So basically, I can talk about anything I want, right, Real? All phenomena, all efforts, and all ways of knowing. Now, you will notice in my presentation that I will give homage not just to Eleonora Massini, but also to a number of other Italian thinkers that influenced my thinking and knowing, and actually the field of future studies and the field of anticipation, I believe. So I would like to start with Antonio Gramsci, who paid a heavy price, you would know, for those of you who know his biography. And Antonio Gramsci asked this critical question that, I'm paraphrasing. He did not ask that question, I'm asking on his behalf. Are all forms of anticipation equal? So Carrie Facer had this wonderful introduction here and said we are all in this together. However, I would like to argue that yes, we are, but we do come from different places. Just still recovering from that queue at Milan airport. Some of us went were there for hours, some of us went through those queues in minutes. So obviously, our societies are structured like that, right? We carry various forms of privilege and various forms of marginalization, all of us, in different areas of our lives. And Gramsci talked about that. He talked about privileged forms. He used the term of cultural hegemony. He talked about dominant systems of meaning. And I would like to argue that those go hand in hand with dominant or hegemonic temporalities. I think we heard a lot here about those dominant hegemonic temporalities over the last few days, and they could be summarized as linear, industrial, and digital. And this is why I think it's really critical to tap into this time literacy as some sort of a prerequisite almost for futures literacy, or part of it. It needs to be part and parcel of what we do when we engage in anticipatory practices, because this epistemological framing of time acts as a boundary. It prefigures our perception of the future and the limits strategic action. So the way you see time is going to influence how you see the future. So to exercise informed choices over our futures, we must first recognize that multiplicities of time perspectives. Barbara Adam, in her many books, argued that this hegemonic time happened that we are currently inhabiting, happened at a particular time in history. So there was this conceptual conjuncture between Newtonian science, neoclassical economics, the mechanical clock, and that created this illusion of uncertainty in a particular way. And that accompanied the industrial way of life. We are trying to move out of it, still struggling, but what would it mean if we do not connect this type of hegemonic time with industrial way of life, but, for example, ecological principles? Because that seems to be the collective vision for our future, at least according to SDGs and a number of other organizations and groups. So hegemonic time is, of course, characterized by chrononormativity. Time is commodity, standardization, exclusion, and social expulsion, measuring and valuing specific time as natural and normal. And in a way, those that do not fit into it are excluded. There is this notion of expulsion if you don't fit quite well. That has been well documented in Australia, for example, where I lived for many decades. With indigenous population, Aboriginal Australians, that they have been excluded from the system by virtue of dealing with time, considering time differently. Rifkin also writes about time wars and says that lots of our conflict is underpinned by that different way we see time. This is a type of temporal colonization that occurs to this day and occurs to all of us. Anytime anybody takes away our time in those waiting queues, or when we are trying to do our business of just living, having to spend half a day dealing with that spinning wheel of slow death, they take away our life. So it's not just our time, it's our life, because time is all we've got. So temporal colonization is a real problem. I wanted to ask this, whether it is a problem, but I already made an argument that it is. And what I heard from you during the last 2 days, that yes, indeed, it is a problem. It is a problem in our governance, the way we govern. It is a problem in education. It is a problem as far as technology is concerned, economy, and so on and so forth. So if it is a problem, we really need to start thinking about alternatives to it. Never mind other people in governments and education and what, although many of us are from those fields as well. But I think our field of foresight and futures and even anticipation is also part of a problem in some ways. I think we do reinforce that temporal colonization. So if you look at some language for organizations that are progressive, really, and that are trying to lead the way in transforming our condition towards something better, you will find all these language of future-proofing, of being future-ready, definitions of strategic foresight, and etc., that I think by its very definition is unitemporal and unidirectional. That's what I think. Thank you, Manuela, for referring to that research that I've done in terms of futures fallacies and cognitive biases, or the predictable irrationality, where we come up with certain patterns of thinking that are irrational but predictably so, as Dan Ariely said. So there is a whole body of research there, and obviously I can't tap into it. But I think it is important to see what is it that we actually want. So we have the way to expand those temporalities through different frameworks, perhaps maybe moving away from kind of this strategic foresight. Because strategic foresight, I feel, if you talk about future-ready something, you obviously know what that future is. So your certainty is based on knowing what the future will be. So you're tapping into the predicted future, the projected future, which always reinforces the status quo, right? So if you want to challenge that kind of future-ready thing needs to be expanded towards something that is more narrative-based or transformative. So I think narrative and transformative foresight, unlike strategic foresight, allow for those multiple temporalities, and I'll try to illustrate that. So the assumption here, obviously, is that with enough data, we can accurately, this is like the current version, or actually it's been around for decades, that yes, maybe we can't predict so well, but if we have large enough set of data, we can actually come up with something tangible. And again, somebody from our field may be a little bit guilty for that. Nate Silver, in his book, The Signal and the Noise, he had a subtitle about why so many predictions fail, but some don't, right? And he argued in that text that if you have large sets of data, your predictions will be accurate. And so many of our organizations are focused on getting those absolutely massive, small pieces of information, small units of information that all of us here probably know are biased one way or another. And saying that, well, we are going to spend all this energy so that we can get that data and extrapolate in the future. Now, Silver argued that until his own predictions fail. And then what did he do? He changed the subtitle of his book. So it's such a clever strategy. I think we can all learn from Nate. He called it The Art and Science of Prediction, the subtitle, instead of Why So Many Predictions Fail But Some Don't. Now, I talked about those biases, right? And psychologists have done a really, I feel, solid work, very interesting work too, talking about some of those biases, once again, all of us inhabit in one way or another. Manuela likes to, and Circa and a few other people here like to talk about paradoxes. So here is one called the time paradox. But there is a cure too, which is what I think the business of futures thinking and futures studies should be about. Diagnosis and prognosis and therapy, as Johann Galtung used to like to say. So they argued, Zimbardo, Boyd, Sword, that all of us have this skewed perspective at the individual level of time. Some of us are more past positive oriented. We talk about the good old times. Some have aversive history, the fall of grace. Then some people and some cultures actually, when this was done in, research was done in Serbia, for example, their present hedonistic and fatalistic orientation predominated. And there are historical reasons for that, because people who feel that they've been disempowered by these big forces throughout their history, their recorded history, just give up. Like, what's the point in trying? Is that change fatigue where you say, well, you know, que sera, sera, right? Just let's enjoy la dolce vita. So those are the approaches that exist in all of our cultures and within all of us, but sometimes one orientation predominates, and that has a cost. Even if you're future-oriented, like I assume if we did a test here, most of us would be future-oriented. We would kind of look more in that direction than in other directions. That also can have a cost. Being, you know, cost of workaholism, missing joy of the present, not being in the present moment. We had a wonderful session on escapism yesterday, so how, and I think René Rohrbrecht as well talked about the neurotic futures fantasizing. So those are maybe a little bit pathological engagements with the future, and why am I saying they're pathological? Because they create problems. At the individual level, they create mental health problems. Here is my chart, retroactively done from the 90s. And I have to say, and a little bit argue with Patrick, I don't know if he's here, escapism was my saving grace. So just thinking that the future will be better was something that I held on to. And at that course in 1993 gave me a way out from the dense and difficult present and the dense and difficult past that we were constantly reminded of. So I think, and as many people before me argued, if you move into the future space, you have more hope because, you know, it's not fixed. There are possibilities out there and you can still do something about it. So most mental health conditions at the individual level would be about distortions with our relationship with time. So if you are suffering from clinical depression, you know, you will not see future as positive. Your thing there would be very, very low because there is no hope. There's just blackness and darkness, and some people then find a solution in suicide because they just can't bear that condition. With past negative and past positive, we know what that leads to. Nostalgia, wanting to go back to the past. Political movements are based on this, right? You're all aware of that. And then people who are present hedonistic or fatalistic forget to plan for the future. So when the future finally arrives, because future is never about the future, it's always about the present. So when the future finally arrives, they get shocked. The whole world was shocked about COVID. It was all like, que sera, sera, even though we had all the warnings from WHO and national governments for years and decades. But then anytime the crisis would come, people would panic. And then when the crisis would stop, like with Ebola, with AIDS, with SARS, then everybody like, oh, whatevers. And even now we are back to normal, right? Even though pathogens are still around and even though more are coming our way, at least according to the projected futures and if current trends continue. So this is the issue here. And as a solution, psychologists argued that if we want to improve on that, we need to have a balanced time perspective at individual level. What does that mean? Doesn't mean that we should all be uniformed in a way how we see time and have this perfectly positioned. It means that we should use different time frames as appropriate, right? It's about temporal harmony. So mental health is, Zimbardo and others argue, about inhabiting a single, it's not about inhabiting a single correct time zone. Rather, a balanced time perspective is the ability to flexibly shift temporal focus based on situational demands, avoiding getting trapped in any specific temporal frame. At the collective level, we are trapped in a specific temporal frame, and that is the hegemonic time I talked about. So to expand on that, to improve on that, we need to expand our range collectively and at the global level. And I think our discipline of anticipation, future studies, foresight, whatever you want to call it, has an absolutely massive responsibility to do so. And for us to do that with others, we need to do it with us as well, So Institute for Future Studies, Italian Institute for Future Studies, had this manifesto they presented the other day, and they were very clear in terms of who they are and what they want. So this certainty of preferred future is critically important in times of uncertainty and impermanence, right? So we need to be aware that there is this multi-temporality out there, but then really be kind of conscious and aware of where we stand in terms of our values and our preferred futures. This is the only way, I think, to go beyond these various, not the only way, one of the ways to go beyond those various illusions and delusions, whether they're forecasting illusions or time distortions or various ego and agency traps, all those cognitive biases and so on and so forth, and expand, as Elise Boulding said, go through really as far as we can in history, and then learn from our ancestors, people who also dealt with similar issues, but before. Discipline of anticipation may be new, but technologies of anticipation are not. They've been around for a very, very long time. We can see them, their material traces, and we can, as I said, learn there, because those conceptions exist pretty much everywhere in human consciousness, wherever we look. But it is due to those cognitive biases, some are cultural, some are individual, that we simply don't. We just don't go out of our comfort zones and look elsewhere. Massini argued in Richard Slaughter, Foundations for the Future Studies, Knowledge Base of Future Studies, published in 1996, that to simplify and understand that complexity and so many ways of looking at anticipation, we can identify three basic patterns, civilizational concepts of time and future. First one is cyclical, where we are looking at recurrent natural phases, and you have particular historical, cultural, civilizational roots there, as you can read. Then there is a linear, which future really, first time, becomes that separate domain to be controlled. And then the spiral, starting from Giambattista Vico and others, where you have this evolutionary interplay of stability and change. Because I was in Australia at the time, I added, when I was writing my first set of articles on time, I added this co-present and internal, which is intertwined with past and present. It is a very interesting notion where we are actually, as I said, dreaming of our ancestors. We do not exist separate from them. We do not exist separate from everything that exists. And we did hear about biological notion of anticipation yesterday. So if we see ourselves as separate from all these things, we get very different material artifacts, and design based on those principles is going to look very different. If you see yourself as part of your ancestors and future generations and actually everything that exists, you will create very different artifacts. You will create very different design. And that design may be to leave the nature in its original condition, rather than constantly trying to improve it, right? So epistemology, ethics, and material effects always go hand in hand. They always, the way our cognitive frames always inform what we do and how we do it. Now, what goes at that individual level, I think it would be wonderful if we can start working to expand at that cultural and civilizational level to create some sort of a cultural and civilizationally balanced time perspective, which is about creating an inclusive, transformed, just and resilient global society of the future, which does not privilege one type of time like we have now, the type of time that is constantly being imposed on us. Rather, it should utilize all cultural and civilizational temporal perspectives as appropriate. So I'm stealing from psychologists. My background is in sociology, so this is what I kind of extrapolated from them. Now, to kind of show a little bit more about what I mean, I'm not sure how many of you were in this field in the 90s, but some of us who were perhaps remember this group. In the 1990s, they were saying everybody was obsessing over year 2000. I myself was panicking. People were saying everything will stop working. Like, you will not be able to get money from the bank. So people were hoarding cash. Because apparently when 1999 turns into 2000, the world as we know it will end. It was amazing. So in 1990s, they said, year 2000, how boring. Let's imagine humanity 3000. And so they did. And they had quite a bit of money, and they funded lots of people to be part of the process. And they came up with design, with paintings, with material effects, and this is one of their products. So it was a large painting, so you can't see all the details here. But basically, I think this is just a brilliant illustration of how that hegemonic idea of who we are as humans and who we are as a global society and who we are in relation to past, present, and future operates. We have a past which is there, and then we have a future that is here, and then we are in the middle, of course. It's very anthropocentric and very androcentric, because you can see where the sun is, like above which gender the sun is there. So you have a nuclear family, what feminists call the serial package family. This is the notion of who we are supposed to be even in our personal, intimate relationships, there is this idea. And then we have this evolution of humans. That also, I've rarely seen, only recently, but for decades and decades, and most scientific books even, when you see the evolution of humans, it's always evolution of a man, right? Because women apparently do not evolve. Women stay connected with the nature. They're ahistorical. They're part of that nature that should be conquered. Go around Europe, you will see so many statues, material effects based on patriarchal imaginings where women are naked and when they're part of waterfall or they're part of this and that. So that is a material effect, something we created because of the epistemological framework of patriarchy. We are not our minds. Amongst those humans creating futures, there are only two. One is a scientist, Marie Curie. I guess they could not include her. She had to die to be there. As one of my colleagues who did research on Serbian mythology said, the only good woman is a dead woman, So she had to be there because obviously she paid a very heavy price for her research. Another woman there is a warrior, Jeanne d'Arc, who also paid a horrendous price. So, ladies, women, friends, if you want to be somewhere at an important place, you know what you need to do. Just drop dead. And of course, no one here has bodies. Everybody is disembodied, so it's only our minds that create the future. The only person who does have body parts is Pablo Picasso, who apparently couldn't paint with his nose. So I think this is a very powerful image because it summarizes, and this is why design is important. We see it. It's something tangible. It's something that we can touch, feel, immediately take in. And what we want to do is to move away from this. So I talked about individual time perspectives. I talked about those 4 basic kind of frameworks or patterns of time at the cultural and civilizational level. But I would like to add this other dimension because we are dealing with 5,000 years of patriarchy in the Western world. It's not globally 5,000 years, but at least in the Western world it's 5,000 years. And then only for the last 100 years, which is a very short period in the life of a society, we've been seeing some changes happen. So if we want to make those changes, we can't stay, we can, but then we only get marginal change. And as I said, I'm interested in transformative foresight. So if you want to transform something at a real level, not just count women, like put them in positions of power where they have to behave, as men or worse, sorry. So this is what we've seen happen all around our societies that are based on particular cognitive framework of competition, of domination, of hierarchy, of colonization. When you put just numbers, staying at that superficial data level or litany level in CLA terms, you don't get transformative change. You just get different bodies that operate in those spaces. So if you want to go deeper, I think in addition, as I said, to futures literacy, we need to do something about this time literacy, and we need to look beyond patriarchal temporalities. Yulia Kristeva wrote in 1979, I believe, about the order of the father. She argued that temporal order that we are calling here today dominant and hegemonic, is an order that privileges masculinized participation and visible productivity. It's time of project and history. And that time excludes women time, that is in the private domain, that doesn't count for anything. It's not paid, it's not counted, it's not valued. It discounts embodiment, as I've seen in that previous image. It kind of disowns and excludes nature, and obviously indigenous continuity. So natural rhythms that refuse mechanical quantification, relational time, family spheres, and unseen care work do not matter. When you work at the university, for example, I remember once I read this article, and that colleague of ours argued that to be there, you need to be an unmarried, and be successful, you need to be an unmarried man with a wife. That means you have a wife who will take care of your things, but you're unmarried, you don't have any responsibilities in that family sphere. So this is the setup. And then doesn't matter which gender enters the setup stays the same unless you do something about the very setup itself. So how do we do this? We start reimagining this architecture of linear exclusion and start working towards temporal coexistence. So this doesn't mean that you suddenly switch to this or that. Balanced time perspective is that these temporal frames coexist, overlap, and interact with and across societies. So eternal time, if we know how to evoke it, so we use time as appropriate rather than time using us. It's a very different relationship with time. We are part of it rather than outside of it. So eternal time anchors us to land and ecological maintenance. Cyclical time aligns us with economic and natural rhythms. Linear time drives necessary technological and policy milestones, and spiral time adapts the systems through complexity and relational networks. Women's time, as I said, within patriarchal framework was outside, but Kristeva and feminist thinkers on temporality are saying that actually women's time already embraces all those different temporal frames. But it also specifically anchors us in relationality, intergenerational equity, and care. So, Giambattista Vico, macrohistorian, talked about this spiral evolution and linear maybe in some ways, and argued that we move from the age of gods, which was ruled by religion and fear, to age of heroes, ruled by nobility and force, and the age of men, ruled by reason and equality. Vico wrote all this some 250 years ago. So, if we kind of try to, again, paraphrase Vico, I'm paraphrasing Gramsci, I'm paraphrasing Vico, I'm doing my best here. What has happened over the last 250 years, we have seen this bifurcation of project and history, looking through feminist and decolonial macro-history lens. And we've seen that we have bifurcation in terms of the age of machines, which is the contemporary reality, which in some ways is actually a hyper-accelerated age of men. And on the other hand, the vision that I hear over and over and over again in most of our workshops, especially when working with young people and people who are, as Elise Boulding and Eleonora Massini argued, outside of those dominant frameworks, they're elsewhere. It's the age of gender and cultural partnership. Which brings me back to Marina Abramović and the kitchen, because that is a design, that is a material effect. It is about connection, about aesthetics, ethics, epistemologies, and material practices. So the kitchen, Abramović says in one of her interviews, was the center of my world. The kitchen was the place where I would tell my grandmother my dreams. All the stories were told in the kitchen. All the secrets were told in the kitchen. All the pieces of advice regarding my life were given in the kitchen. All the future telling through the cups of black coffee took place in the kitchen. It was kind of place where the spiritual world and the daily world met and mixed. All my best memories came from there. So what did patriarchy do with that? It actually said the kitchen doesn't matter, made a division between La Piazza, the public sphere, where the public domain is what we count and what we relate to, and the private domain, La Cucina, where it is that growing of futures generations where it takes place and that relationality and care takes place. To support it, there had to be not only bifurcation of time, but bifurcation of space. So we've seen, as Krista writes, the order of the father, versus this new emerging model, nurture and parent model of intergenerational equity that Lakov talks about. One of the best public kind of examples of that public space is the man on the horse. You see him everywhere. Everywhere around Europe. It's about, of course, obviously, domination of nature, of other humans, of women, of, it's an example of, is that age of heroes that Vico talks about. But that is also a place of finite action, the theater of power, and the climax of action. The private herd actually operates on very different principles. There is time of intergenerational connectivity, is definitely slower. There is unseen labor, and there is a generative cycle happening there with real people in real time, meeting the needs of the most vulnerable. So there is a theater of the public sphere, La Piazza, the theater of power, where the most powerful are rewarded. And then there is this other theater where the most vulnerable are taken care of. So what happens when La Cucina enters La Piazza? You get very different material effects. You get very different statues. You get very different KPIs, to use business language. You get very different notion of what matters. This is a monument to children of Lidice in Czech Republic by Marie Uchitilova, the memorial to the children victims of the war. So what I'm saying here is that epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics is always connected one way or another. It just depends on which cognitive frame you want to utilize. So once you have a different framework, you create very different material artifacts in the public domain. Where to from here? I think this is the question. That's always the question. Because as I said many times, and most of us keep on saying it over and over again, the future is not about the future. It's about making better decisions, using future as a resource to see where we want to go, having that certainty of preferred future in times of uncertain possibilities. Raina Eisler, the only female macro-historian I know of, argued that we have two basic choices for our futures. One is to continue on that dominator androcracy path, and the other one is to move towards partnership, or what she terms Gilani. And then she does something very cheeky. Here is another paradox. She actually says, yes, we do have these two kind of choices, and they should not be seen as A and B options. They are like Weberian ideal models, for those of you who know Max Weber's work in sociology. So there are those ideals models. Of course, we exist on the continuum between those two. So she says, okay, so here are our choices. We can align this way, we can align that way, we can be in the middle. And then she says, well, actually, if we want to survive as a human civilization, we only have one choice. So this is very interesting. That doesn't mean that you now suddenly have just one option for the future. Because between A and B, and if you choose B based on a different cognitive framework, you can still have B1, B2, B3, B5. So this dichotomy between war and peace, I think, is just absolutely boggles my mind, because you can have all sorts of peaceful, non-violent ways of resolving conflict. There are millions of those strategies that people have already come up with, and there are experts here, Felipe, Kyle, many others, that actually work with that, April, that work with that notion that there are many, many different ways. So that doesn't mean you just have one future. It's actually multiple. But the framework is different. And framework is, Eisler says, based on our best hope to survive as humans on this planet. Planet will be fine once we are gone, but it is about us and our civilization and legacy and future generations. So once again, because we are in Italy, I thought to rebrand Raina Eisler. Everybody's doing branding and rebranding these days. So I would like to identify those as two basic templates. One is Machiavellian, the other one is Montessorian. And those two basic ideal models have very different views of power, of violence, intergenerational equity, and geographical scope. That is critically important, geographical scope, because most of our initiatives exist within this defensive nationalism. So it is national colonialism, patriarchy, if you want to add capitalism, fine, and a few other ones that are actually part of pathologies of our time. To address those pathologies that are creating all sorts of problems in terms of how hot it is outside, how long we wait in a queue, or worse, we need to move towards something else. And Montessori proposed that a while ago. She talked about collaborative globalism, and so did Massini and Balding and many other thinkers. We know what Machiavellian effects look like, what the material effects of Machiavellian politics, worldviews, and frameworks look like. I said in Trento, this is one of the worst uses of anticipation and abuses of futures that I've ever seen. I still stand on that. It is this notion that somehow the image of the future will save us. But even the image of the future can be toxic. Like there is no fantasy that is ideologically neutral, even with gazillion data points. So how do we imagine, what do we participate in is critical. Right now, all over Europe, we are anticipating for the future we apparently don't want. And I don't understand that. This is why I actually started writing on futures fallacies. Why do we create strategies anticipating and aligning ourselves with the future we don't want? We do know. We don't know what the future will be like, but we do know about consequences. And if we learn from history, we know what militarization does to a society. We are already seeing effects in many countries of Europe where social welfare is sacrificed for national defense and security. So that's already happening. So almost all parties are anticipating the world in which might rules over right and thus spending on warfare. And then they actively work on creating that reality, right? Self-fulfilling prophecies. I haven't seen a scenario, maybe there are, please enlighten me, where there is some sort of a working it out with Russia and welcoming it into family, European family. I don't know. I haven't seen it. So to create different present, future material realities, we obviously need different epistemologies, ethics, and aesthetics, or design. That evolution of spiral requires, obviously, dismantling of colonial and patriarchal architecture at a very deep level, redefining leadership, merging time, synthesizing both the public and the private sphere. And we know what that looks like. We've run a workshop a few days ago, and one of our participants, when she was working with CLA and her own personal metaphor, she said her personal metaphor in her organization, and that's the tough question Sana asked me. So I know I'm running out of time, but I have to respond to Sana. She said, what do we do? What do we do, right? When we find ourselves, when we have Montessorian ethics, and find ourselves in Machiavellian places. And she said she is struggling. She's in this organization and she's in a society where she can't say anything, she can't speak truth to power, and her role is that of justicia, like justice. You know, she's holding justice, balancing. And I said, that's a lovely metaphor. She says, no, it's exhausting. And it is very tiring. Try to stand like this all your life. Try to go against dominant systems of meaning all the time. Try to embody that double standpoint epistemology and work anywhere. You will be exhausted, that's guaranteed. So you need lots of courage and you need lots of work to kind of do some inner power creation within yourself. And then, of course, align with hopefully similarly thinking people that support you and strengthen you. So we are seeing it. We are seeing what those alternatives are when law and legal systems are concerned. We are seeing them in terms of rethinking economics and governments. Another Italian thinker, Mariana Mazzucato, and Francesca Albanese, obviously. We are seeing it amongst young people who do not have uncertainty in terms of whether they do or do not want to have the right to the future. They want the right to the future, diritto a un futuro. They want it. So there is certainty of desired future that we can again tap into. And that is our saving grace once again, whether it's escapism or it's something actually more concrete that we can collectively work towards. How do we get there? I think through humanistic perspective, obviously, rather than nationalistic. We need to unlearn and challenge traditional knowledge, which is, I think, what I argued in this presentation, and then make it come alive, which is the work not of sociologists and peace and conflict and futures thinkers, but designers. So it is wonderful that so many designers are here, because I hope you people can make it tangible and make it work. So we need to consciously choose influences to uphold in terms of going towards those visions that have been around for a while, that so many social movements of today, so many participants in our workshops share. And then enhance, as I said, kind of expand that range we start speaking truth to futures, right? I think this is our responsibility of this group here. Now, we've been given already, as I said, we have this short-termism in terms of thinking about the future. It seems that our brains are a little bit designed that way, but we also have short-termism when it comes down to the past. So unprecedented times and polycrisis, this is only, I think, possible when we don't take into account what happened before. So there were people before us who gave us some sort of ingredients of how to anticipate those visionary futures in dark times, And I think what I heard over the last 2 days, many people feel that we live in dark times and they can sense even more darkness coming. So that's a heavy load, right? So they work with that, Joanna Macy, Fred Pollack, Elise Boulding, and many, many others, saying that we need to imagine those visionary futures grounded in deeper spiritual awareness of the human condition, all of us in this together, as Carrie said, and then an intellectual awareness of human folly, a historical empathy with humans from earlier times, and a further and conscious development of 21st century utopias, of a clean green world of abundance joyfully shared amongst all. I mean, it's there. The visions are there, the strategies are there, movements are there, desires are there, certainty of that coming world in terms of the preferred future is also there. Now, to go there, obviously there are different strategies. I will close with Maria Montessori, who said that to do that, we can't just rely on politics. We need to rely on education. We need to rely on all of us educating ourselves and then spreading that further, because that's where the work starts. And then once that work is done, hopefully we find ourselves in a nice kitchen, La Cucina of the Anticipation Conference Milano 2026. And I hope you can take this further with you. We can obviously continue conversations during lunch and during tea break and so on. What is that world, the image of the world? It's our responsibility to be very explicit about it, to create those visions that appeal to people, and then to create some different types of temporalities around it and very different design and material practices. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivana.
I really want to thank Ivana for this fantastic piece. And I really want to thank you for the positionality of this discussion, how you embrace even the challenge to mention all those Italian thinkers. And I try to give a little of it. I really think that this is a sort of very encouraging last keynote speech. And I'm willing that this kind of spirit can permeate our last mile. And I don't know if questions are proper because you are closing with a question, with several questions, which are very interesting. And they're so connected with what we have done during these days, because what we're trying to do is trying to understand how we can join philosophy, sociology, and design practices, and art. I want to point out that art is an important point because it's so inspirational, and it's always testing the borders of what is feasible, what is not, or pointing out at issues that we still haven't tackled. That it was really inspirational. Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe someone want to make a comment? No, no, she doesn't want any comment.
Yeah, it's going to be very short. Hi, I'm Sanna Ketonen-Oksa from Finland. I usually never take the stage. But I knew I was expecting nothing else than this from Milana. And I just like the idea of everything you brought up. I think future studies really needs this kind of courage and wisdom. I think that when we met for the first time some years ago, I gave you the metaphor of wisdom in the shadows. And I'm really happy to see you coming out of the shadows more every year. And also what was really fantastic that you're bringing the mental wellness being. And all this, it's very, very important for us all and for the societies that we work at. So bringing that in front was very important. And I want to finish with the thing that when I was putting my notes on my notebook, that was long before the picture where you mentioned me and you had Francesca Albanese. And I wrote that Milana is the Francesca Albanese in future studies. So that was actually something I pictured you as. So thank you for being here and bringing this wonderful, inspirational keynote for us.